Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar about building strong board superintendent relationships. I am Dr. Tracy Frederick, the Executive Director of the Kansas School Board Resource Center, and Ward Cassidy, our Senior Advisor, is here with us today as well. If you are new to our webinars or if you're not familiar with Kansas School Board Resource Center, I want you to know that our mission is to help school board members be effective advocates for students and improve academic outcomes. This afternoon, we are excited. We're pleased to welcome Dr. William Hughes and Ms. Kim Amidzek with us. Both Dr. Hughes and Ms. Amidzek will introduce themselves to you in their conversation, but you should know that both have served successfully in the superintendent role and have consulted with school boards, resulting in dramatic improvement in academic achievement for districts and improved trust, confidence, and transparency in the superintendent board relationship. I know that they have a lot to share, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do want to let you know that we will have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end of their conversation. So I will ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box at the very bottom of the screen, and then I'll ask those at the end of the presentation when it's appropriate. If you registered early for the webinar, you received some materials from Dr. Hughes and Ms. Amidzek, and if you did not, I will put into the chat a link to the materials that they will reference in their presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Hughes, and we look forward to hearing what you had to say. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tracy and Ward. Very good afternoon to everyone who is here. And we want to start off first with a thank you, and that's a thank you to the Kansas School Board Resource Center for the opportunity to talk about board superintendent relationships and how you can develop even a stronger relationship than you may have now. Second, we also are very appreciative and thank each of you for your service to your community, especially around academic outcomes and fiscal responsibility. My name is Bill Hughes, and I'm a former Greendale Schools superintendent. Prior to that, I was a building principal and teacher and spent most of my career focused on public schools. In the early 2000 teens, I loved being a superintendent until I didn't, and moved on to working primarily in urban schools around leadership development and creating schools for low-income kids. At the end of my life, or end of my career, I did work for a national foundation and really started to see what the other side of that table looks like as far as funders who are interested in growing great schools.
Hi there. My name is Dr. Kim Amidzek, and I am working actively in a school district, actually the district that Bill was the superintendent of. So I'm in the Greendale Schools. This is my 6th year as superintendent, and we have done a lot of work to rebuild trust after broken trust with the community in 2019. And so you can imagine starting in 2020 and working through building that trust, it really was focused on transparency and a lot of tools where the community, and the students and the board all were talking the same language. So that has been how we've worked to rebuild that excellence in our community.
We have several outcomes that we're hoping to be able to leave you with at the end of this session. First of all, this is a overview of a half-day or full-day workshop around board superintendent relationships. It also includes a set of assumptions, tools on how actually you can make these shifts, as well as some methods to understand the situation and really close the gap between what the current situation is between your board and superintendent and what your aspirations are. I want to start with the end. And so if any of you want to bail out right now, what you can really take from us is it really boils down to one thing between board members and superintendents. It's the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Really treat people the way you want to be treated. And what I think is different than a lot of groups that get in front of board members to think about how to create schools that reflect what parents and communities aspire for their kids is the uniter is around academic outcomes, obviously better or stronger academic outcomes, and fiscal responsibility. Those are two uniters. And by academic outcomes, even 18 months ago, Tracy and I would probably be talking quite a bit about academic achievement. And I want to be very clear, we've morphed to academic outcomes because communities also have to think about what do they define academic success or academic achievement in their community. And so I want to start with a set of assumptions. And these assumptions are board members come to the work wanting to do the right thing, that the superintendent is capable and able to do the job, and all in, not somebody who's needs a few more years before they reach retirement, or somebody who can be a part-time superintendent but has other work that they want to do. They have to stake their destiny to the community. And the district's performance is a reflection of their life's work. Local voters want local government to work. And it's up close and personal, as many of you can probably are already starting to experience. Local politics is sometimes more brutal than regional or state politics. We also believe that parent power is here to stay, and a large number of what I would call the education establishment doesn't really accept that yet, which could be a root of where you may be having some difficulties between your board and superintendent, is that parent power is here to stay. Many of the new board members are a reflection of what that parent power looks like. And our best advice to you on that is embrace the parent power rather than fighting it, because I think it's going to be here for at least a generation. The education market is fragmenting. It's fragmenting at the national and state level, and it's fragmenting within states. And so Wisconsin is in one place, Kansas is another. But to think that public schools have a monopoly is also my assumption that that is a core problem between board members and superintendents. We also believe that consensus does not equate with good decision making all the time. If you're working in a board that is split, majority rules, and we believe that there's going to be winners and losers in some of those votes. But if you're working in the minority on a board, the assumption is you are part of the loyal opposition, and you're going to be united with the board around the final decisions because your constituents are counting on you. And we're going to come back to that term around constituents because this is the teaser. It's actually, we believe, different than what most local board members believe their constituents are. So wait to hear about that. We also believe that board superintendent relationships can improve if you have a plan and unite around the interests of the kids and families that you're serving. And last, behavior can cause conflict even more than words. And so it's very important that you measure your words, but also that your behaviors are aligned with what you're saying you're going to do. Let's start with a definition around what is an effective board superintendent relationship. It's basically a shared vision with defined roles and transparent communication. This is right out of the NASB definition of what an effective board superintendent relationship is. What's very important to think about is that school boards are the only local school boards are the only elected officials whose constituents are not necessarily who elected them. Their constituents are the students. And I believe that is part of the innate conflict we're seeing between board members and superintendents, is that sometimes board members believe that their constituents are the people that elected them. They're the people who chose them to represent the interests of the students. A dysfunctional relationship, some of this is based on board member behavior, with role encroachment, personal agendas. Some of it is superintendent effort around accountability and a mismatch between what the board's vision of accountability is, the community's vision of accountability, and the administrative vision of accountability is. Some of it is poor fit, especially if you have a long-standing superintendent. It could be that at this point in time, the abilities and knowledge and skills of that district leader may no longer fit with what the aspirations are for the community or what the community's needs are. And so that fit, we're not talking about the board superintendent fit, we're talking about the community fit. And then some of the relationships can be affected by the community health and the types of communities as they're developing or devolving due to economic or political changes or demographic changes. But community health also impacts what that board superintendent relationship and the dysfunction can look like. The slide we have here just outlines some of what the dysfunction is. The only one I would highlight is failure to hit outcomes and retain focus on achievement. Even if the board, and I want to be very clear here, even if the board is not interested or is caught up in other issues beyond academic outcomes, it's the superintendent's job to try to keep that focus there, which can create more dysfunction and goes back to the whole notion of fit. Here's what the relationship can look like. This is taken, if you look at your district mission statements, you probably see this in almost every board policy, classic NASB stuff here. Pillars is another set of board and superintendent responsibilities. Not going to go through this to you. You can come back and look at it. End of the day, a unified voice in public once the decision has been made is a basic assumption and a necessary part of a functional relationship. Some of the new research around board superintendent relationships is starting to show that there is different lenses that the superintendent and the board are not just looking at issues, but how they see what leadership at the community level should look like. And so the chart you have in front of you is a sample of what school board members' opinions are on different education issues and how they differ between Democrats, Republicans, US adults in general, and board members. And so we're not going to get into the detailed issues. We would if we were doing a longer workshop. But the important thing here is that board members often see high profile education issues differently than the rest of their community does. And this is from the AASA Superintendent Leadership Report, which is an analysis of the state of the superintendency put together by the American Association of School Administrators. They do it, as I understand it, twice in a decade, usually, well, in 2020 and in 2025. What I'm putting up here that I want you to think about is there is a growing divide between where female and male superintendents operate as leaders. And I think some of this could be extrapolated to some of the causes of conflict between the board and the superintendent, where the board members have a view of how the leadership team and the leader is operating versus how gender issues can drive the behavior of the leader, which create conflict. And in fact, if you look at the female side of it, it actually bodes well for a stronger board superintendent relationship over the long term versus the male piece where they strive to be the visible face of the district. And then my favorite one, which is they have an inflated view of their abilities and influence, which starts to grate on board members, especially female board members. And so some of this, I think, is leadership behavior that the savvy superintendent can actually adjust some of their behaviors to fit the current needs of what that community looks like and the trends in successful leadership. Assessing the relationship in any kind of work where you're starting to look at the board superintendent relationship, these are the kind of questions that a good consultant takes the board and the superintendent through. And again, we're pushing the whole notion around the uniting factor is around academic outcomes and financial responsibility. Then you move more into clarifying roles and responsibilities. I love to have people think a lot about who are your board influencers, who are your board's freeloaders, board members that show up at board meetings unprepared, or they're not willing to do the deep thinking that's required for the hard decisions to be made at the board level, or they lean on data that only supports their preconceived opinion versus what an informed opinion as it evolves in conversations and deliberation by the board. It's also absolutely critical that the superintendent has regular check-ins, both with the full board and individual board members. And there's a lot of how-tos with this, but you should be hearing from your superintendent before every board meeting so there are no surprises. This is not a walking quorum. This is just checking in to make sure that everyone understands what's on the agenda, that the board members have done their homework, that they're able to express some of their concerns with the superintendent prior to the meeting. In other words, no surprises.
That is a regular practice in our district, and I have them actually on the calendar so that the board members know when to expect a call and a check-in so that it's routine and consistent, and we check in on what's on the agenda and what things are happening that they want to talk about and that they questions that they might have so that I can make sure any member of my team who is presenting a report that night is prepared to answer those questions and not be caught off guard in public. And then beyond that, we schedule times where we're checking in on goals at the board table in public. So 3 times a year, we are publicly and transparently having conversations about progress towards the goals on that are set by the board at the beginning of the year.
The other piece that we don't go into in this presentation is the role of the board president and the importance of the board president keeping the governing coalition together, and also dealing with board behavior, board member behavior that is starting to deviate around the norms, values, and beliefs that the board has set together. And so the board president actually working closely with the superintendent and the governing coalition is very key to a strong, productive board superintendent relationship. There's a series of governance models, and we can provide more detail offline. But one of the areas of conflict often between board members, boards as a whole, and the leadership team and superintendent is oftentimes they have different visions for what their governance model is going to be. And so if you look at what most state associations and national school board associations and superintendent groups advocate for as a policy governance model, where you have a whole set of policies that are in place. Sometimes that can actually have a breakdown around roles and responsibilities for the board members and the leadership team. But there are other models out there, including a balanced governance model where there's a set of agreed upon duties and execution methods, a micromanagement model, which in most cases is inappropriate, but if the superintendent has left the district or has been removed from the position and you're in a transition period with a leadership team in place, or the need of stepping in because of some kind of crisis, there is a place for the micromanagement model, generally not too much. And then there is a macro management governance model, which is often dysfunctional as well, where it's an inner board and it's largely ceremonial. And in truth, a board member or two and the superintendent are operating. We can go into that in more detail offline. There's also the theory around board superintendent levels of authority. These are different levels from policy governance at level 1, where the superintendent has very clear understanding of what their authority is, to level 3, which is it's almost everything is approved by the board and the administration executes on the action items. Level 2 is generally the best place to be, but all three can work.
So in my district, one of the things that we did very early on in the first year of the superintendency is we sought to clarify what are the roles and responsibilities of the board and what are the roles and responsibilities of the administrative staff. Bill, am I able to take over sharing, or do you want to not go that way?
I will advance the way you tell me, unless
Okay,
something.
we'll let it be then. There is a document that's attached that is called the levels of engagement. And in this space, we had a board retreat in which we sat down and we looked at all aspects of the work in the district. Categories around strategy, curriculum and instruction, district operations, human resources, financial and regulatory management, external relations, superintendent effectiveness, and corporate governance. And in each of those spaces, we have 5 possible areas. Does the administrative staff recommend or decide? Or, and does the school board approve? Are they informed? Or are they not involved or consulted? So each area, that helps to guide the work. So I know what's expected of me. I know if something is a decision I need to make. I know if it's something that we need to bring forward for board approval and start to build capacity around what we are doing. In all cases, when decisions are made, there's some level of communication and informing of the board. The only space in which they are not involved is very limited, and that's around sponsorships and advertising. And that's about it. Otherwise, the board is consulted or informed, but we have these large buckets where we've been very specific about what tasks need to be done and when it's recommended and when it's decided by the administration so that the board knows their role.
let's move towards board norms. So values, guardrails, and norms. One of the things that's really important is think to build up that comes out of the conversation around the levels of engagement is a set of approved behaviors, values of board members. Kim, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, these have actually been revised recently between the board and myself during a retreat or a workshop that we did with a consultant. And so we have 4 norms around our personal commitments to the group and 3 norms about how we behave around others. So you can see there that this is what was determined and decided during a time. So I will be prepared and engaged while in attendance. I will commit to be an active listener with my board teammates. I commit to make decisions based on facts from all sides, extenuating circumstances, and above all, what's best for students. As Bill said, the students are your constituents. And so when you're making that decision, they need to be in the forefront. I understand it's my role to set policy and employ the superintendent. All others will be recommended. If I vote against recommendations, it is done so with an understanding of all pertinent facts. Now, on the levels of engagement, there it's slightly beyond this, but this is what their agreements are. And then in terms of value, I commit to eliminate prejudging and gossip as it relates to school business, school staff, and my board teammates. I commit to board teammates to support the decisions made by the majority of the board, even if I don't fully agree. And I commit to my board teammates to support the mission of the district and embrace the vision looking out the windshield and minimize looking out the rearview mirror. Now, there have been times when board members have violated one of these norms. They may have, we might have a large change where there's a lot of big feelings around things like schedules or what the marching band is going to do this weekend. And because they're members of the community, they might engage in some gossip and they might start to collect information. And when that happens, we have agreements with the board president, and Bill referred to the roles of the board president, that there is a check of, hey, you're stepping over the line here. What do you need to get back in line? So there are conversations that happen, but those conversations can't happen if we don't have agreements about how we're going to behave. And I recently had this happen, and I was able to, in addition to the board president, I was able to step in and say, hey, that's really outside of the scope of your work. You're not going to put the hours and minutes into the calendar. So that's clearly delineated to me in policy. And I understand that there's big feelings and we'll listen to feedback, but I need you to push anybody who's talking to you, tell them to call me and we'll talk. And that's because we have these board norms so that we've established before we have a big issue how we're going to respond.
The only other thing I would add there that Dr. Midzik didn't mention is these norms of engagement and action are on every board meeting agenda. And
Yes.
so they come at the end of the agenda and they serve as a reminder, but they're also a great way to be able to manage if you have agendas at board meetings available for people. I like to call them board watchers, but the public that attends your meeting, that they actually you can refer to those norms of engagement and action for people who may not be as informed about the how to conduct oneself at a board meeting. And so some of this is just good standard operating procedure, but you don't see these board norms of engagement and action in a lot of districts. And the board members may be aware of them, but the community isn't. And so this is just all part of a platform of tools that you can use to improve and stabilize the relationship. Another area that's absolutely critical is superintendent evaluation. And you have in upcoming webinars with the Kansas School Board Resource Center a session devoted solely to superintendent evaluation. And so I'll defer to that, but all I'm going to say about the evaluation process is a couple of things. One is should not be a once a year compliance test. This should be part of a continuous improvement commitment with ongoing dialogue. I'm of the belief that this should actually be done quarterly in closed session with conversation around what the board superintendent relationship looks like. And at minimum, every other month, and in most districts, monthly, there should be a dashboard that is linked to the district outcomes that the board is focused on that are directly related to the superintendent's performance. And ideally, these should be focused academic outcomes specific to the district that the board has agreed on, that the superintendent is working towards, leading the leadership team and the staff towards, and at the same time, some fiscal goals that are being worked on. And then you circle back with the superintendent evaluation during the closed sessions at least twice a year, maybe 3 times a year, ideally 4 times a year. It also gives a chance in most states in a closed session where the board and superintendent can have a heart-to-heart talk about some of the board behaviors or superintendent behaviors that are creating conflict or are festering. And so the evaluation process is actually a very key area. Obviously, the evaluation process should be set up in a way where there's a written document that goes with that. You would be surprised at the number of high-profile school districts I encounter here in Wisconsin, in the Milwaukee metro area or around the country that really are not going through with a high-quality superintendent evaluation process. And in some cases, it isn't even a written document. The last thing I'll say is that some states have state mandated superintendent evaluation policies, regardless of that. And so you have to follow the procedure and the forms that are mandated by the state. You have to work with that. But I can tell you that Aaron Salt's presentation coming up later this spring around the evaluation process, even in states like that, has a form that could be used as a guide. And so we included the chalk beats evaluation form in the handouts for you to look at. But the key thing here is having ongoing discussions and keeping it simple so that you can stay focused around the educational outcomes and financial reporting. Last area we want to focus around is budget updates. No one who is serious about making local government work can not be fiscally responsible. This is a uniter, and only the ideologues are the ones who are not going to be financially responsible with the taxpayers' money. And so again, this is an area where boards and superintendents can come together. Might not be in lockstep, might not vote 7-0 on the budget, but everyone should have the focus around fiscal responsibilities. We've got a series of reports that you can use that, again, should be presented to the board on a monthly basis, not just the state compliance budget reports that can often be confusing and hard to understand, especially for new board members or the public, but clear in plain, simple language. Here's how we're doing on money coming in, revenue. Here's how we're doing on expenditures, what we're spending our money on. And so no one can operate in a way where they are not informed about the status of the financial situation of the district. Superintendents get in trouble on poor budgeting processes and management, and it leads to an erosion of faith. These are sample reports around revenue, expenses, and what's absolutely key is here's where you, in the far column on the right, that here's where we are on financial year to date. And so if you're over 100%, you're over budget. And somebody should ask that question, like, well, why are we over budget here? And in most cases, the business official or the superintendent can usually answer that question. But when you boil these reports down to basic, clear language, no one can be surprised if you have financial problems. And so, what I say to superintendents without their boards present and to boards without their superintendents present is develop a monthly report that is presented in public in clear, simple language that the board likes so that everyone is on the same page for the finances. Conflicts, we know the types of bad behaviors some of you may be seeing in your boards. At the end of the day, embrace the conflict and deal with it rather than fighting about it. And seek support to be able to create consensus around the two key areas. This is a slide that almost didn't make it into the presentation. And it's really, are you above the line or are you below the line? And so as a board member or the superintendent, how do you enter into the discussion around every major decision the board has to make? Are you curious, open, learning, and disciplined? Or are you below the line where you're defensive, you've made up your mind, you've got a closed mind, and sometimes you just want to be right? And so we often want you to think about, are you operating above the line or below the line? It's natural to want to be below the line. That's human behavior, and that's not anything that's something you should be ashamed of. What you want to be striving for is to pull yourself above the line with the lens of what is in the best, what's best for the students and ergo the parents.
Bill, can you go back to that for 1 second?
Yes.
One of the things that I catch myself, because oftentimes when we're going to the board for a decision, I'm making the recommendation. And so I feel committed and am defensive of that moving on and through. And sometimes the board has valid questions. Not that they're opposed to making any kind of movement or change, but that they have valid questions. And I refer to this and have to check myself, like, I'm feeling defensive about this. How do I reset myself to be able to be open and curious and find a solution or common ground or help navigate what the concern is so that we can get a better solution?
Well, that, if you think about it, Kim, that goes to just what are the assumptions?
Yes, exactly.
The assumptions are, we assume everybody's entering the room with positive intentions. We're assuming everybody is trying to put the needs of kids first. You're not all friends. You're not all hanging out on a Saturday night.
No.
The whole idea is, are you trying to find the best right decision for the community and for the students? And a little conflict is not a bad thing. That if you have conflict, you've actually are seeing change happen.
Exactly.
But it's very comfortable to be below the line. We wanted to talk a little bit about gap analysis, and there is a handout that was sent out to the people around what a gap analysis can do for you. But especially if you're in the process of replacing your superintendent or planning a transition and succession planning with the superintendent, that a board should do a gap analysis around all the key areas of the operation of the district. What is often left out is do a gap analysis around what is the current state of the board superintendent relationship and what is the desired one. Where do you want to go to? Good search consultants conduct a formal or informal gap analysis to try to figure out where the board wants to land with their new superintendent. If you're in a static situation where the board and superintendent are continuing to work together, a gap analysis is a very analytical way to be able to look at here's where we're at, here's what's working, here's what's not working, here's our aspirational or preferred future, here's where we'd like to get to, what's the gap and how do we close it? So, and you don't need to bring in a high-end consultant to do a gap analysis. A good board president with a set of board members that are actually committed to trying to figure out what's the desired relationship can do this themselves. And in fact, sometimes that's the most effective way to do it. If it's a more difficult relationship, it's better to have a consultant in the room because sometimes that can mediate the conflict and mitigate the bad behaviors. So mediate and mitigate. Collaborative culture, that's all part of what you're aiming towards with the gap analysis. I would just say in closing, one of the uniters, especially post-pandemic for school boards, can be not just fiscal responsibility, but identifying trends and where K-12 education is going, rather than looking in the rear view mirror and fighting the old battles. Constituency groups, especially within the education establishment, are really good at getting board members and local boards to fight about issues that they cannot resolve. And so sometimes these trends that are coming down the road, they're interesting, they're important, because you need to be thinking very clearly about what are the, for example, employment skills that are going to be necessary for kids who are going to graduate in 2033, 2035. Likely everyone sitting at the board table won't be in that room, but they are setting the stage for that. And it's a place where you can actually find common ground with people you disagree with. And that goes back to the basic assumption around people locally want their community to work. And oftentimes, on both sides of the political spectrum, you have outsiders coming in with their agendas to drive state policy versus what is the best set of work that needs to be done in the local community. Coming out of the capacity or coming out of the gap analysis, you need to have some goals. All of us at School Boards for Academic Excellence and at the Kansas School Board Resource Center, we believe strongly in SMART goals. A capacity roadmap is a planning document that's different than strategic planning. I'm a fan of the capacity roadmap. Other people are a fan of strategic planning. Everyone knows you must have SMART goals. The beauty of the capacity roadmap is it's a fancy word developed by Accenture for a project plan. And if you know what a project plan is, you set a goal and then you need a set of action steps to be able to drive what you're working towards. And so in the case of the board superintendent relationship, it would be much of what we talked about there. And then you have regular check-ins to be sure you're getting that done. So the last thing I would say, and then we'll open it up to Ward to put Dr. Amidzik and I on the grill, is I would really encourage, especially new board members, to come at this work like a Swiss Army knife. And what you want to be is dependable, you want to be prepared, and you want to be up to the task. And if you put the needs of kids and the aspirations of the family and the community for what the future of their children are going to be, you're going to be able to figure out the right decisions locally. We have a worksheet that we also provided. We're not going to take you through that worksheet, but Kim Amidzik and I would be very interested in, if you fill out that worksheet, we'd be happy to give you some feedback on that. We'd share that with Tracy and Ward if you're okay with it. But it's really a way for us to understand better, A, did we hit the mark today? And B, do you have some action steps coming out of the hour you've invested with us? So Ward, fire up the grill.
Well, thank you, Bill and Kim. And I'm going to move it over to Ward in a minute. Just want to remind everyone you can put questions in the Q&A box, and I'll have a couple of questions also. If Ward has a few, we'll just kick it off with you, as Bill said.
Just a comment, Bill, Kim, very great presentation. If you were a new board member, you just became overwhelmed with all the information. There is a whole lot going into board superintendent relationships, and I think you covered it all well. I don't have any specific questions. Just the comment is that everybody involved in your room, board members, superintendents, have to be vested for the best interest of the students to make it successful. And I've been around a long time, and the boards and the superintendents are all on the same page, seem to have the best districts. So I would say all this information you provided, anybody that wants to use it to work towards those goals of having great relationships between the superintendents and board will have a better school district. So great presentation, a lot of work for any new board members or old board members that want to use any of this, but it certainly would be worth anybody's time to be invested in using this information. So thank you guys very much.
Well, the one question I guess I would have, I think it is so critical, as you pointed out, with clarifying the roles. You talked about those as norms. Oftentimes, new school board members will walk into a new school board role, and all of the norms are already set. They're just trying to figure it out as they go along. But I think making those overt norms and being very deliberate about that is invaluable. Puts everybody, as you said, Dr. Midzik, on the same page. So, how would you suggest, if there's somebody who's watching, implement that? I know that we had some new school board members elected last November. They've been in maybe three board meetings. Some have been in three board meetings. So they're a little bit down the road, but not too far. How might you suggest that they would implement this to establish those specific, deliberate norms that everybody understands? Everybody's on the same page. They know what is acceptable, what is not acceptable.
Well, I think what's helpful is immediately following the elections that the board president makes an effort to either reaffirm the norms or redevelop the norms with the new composition of the board. And if that hasn't happened, then a new board member should certainly ask the board president, do we have norms? Where are they located? And ask questions to bring that back out into a public setting. So to ask where they are, if they're not obvious. In our district, they're obvious because they're right at the bottom of the board agenda. But to talk with the board president, and hopefully the board president can put that in the annual cycle to have that conversation immediately following. We have a reorganization meeting, the meeting after elections, and that is a time in which they're revisited and affirmed or reviewed.
Excellent. Go ahead. Did you want to say something, Dr. Hughes?
I think in Kansas, you have a bit of a opportunity around that they don't have in some states. So in many states, because these are nonpartisan elections, and one of the things that School Boards for Academic Excellence is committed to is we're working to be nonpartisan. We're trying to keep the partisanship to a minimum. And so in Wisconsin, our elections for the board are coming up 2 weeks from today, April 7th. And the new board members take office and come to the board table by the end of April. And at the same time, then they reorganize the board, which, as Dr. Midzik said, that's where the board president has the opportunity to revisit the norms when they reorganize or as part of the onboarding process. You elect in November, mm-hmm. and they take office in January. Mm-hmm. And so you've got a bit of a longer period of time. The other thing that would be interesting would be creating a toolkit on board onboarding, new board member onboarding. And I have to say, working with different states, the state associations tend to have a playbook they use. My lens, and I'm only speaking from Bill Hughes right now, is my lens is I'm going to be kind here, it's an antiquated playbook. Some people would say it's a playbook that reflects what the establishment wants to have, or they have a model where this is how we've done it and we'll teach you how to do it, versus why some of those new board members have been elected by their community because of the shift in the community's culture. And so I think you have a better opportunity and a longer runway to get board members up to speed. And it all then goes back to not necessarily the superintendent, although the superintendent is a key part of the onboarding process. It's really the board president that needs to be driving that. And so, and ideally in partnership with the district administrator.
I think that offers also, as you were mentioning earlier, the opportunity to establish that the students are constituents, the constituents. That is very different. Would you speak for just a moment about that? Just go a little bit more in depth about that statement.
So that comes from the study of board members with the Fordham Institute, and then builds on research that was done in the 2000 teens up until the pandemic by a couple of different national think tanks, AEI on the right, Brookings on the left, who were looking, frankly, at different ways of creating better school governance models. And they were working somewhat together and somewhat parallel. And one of the unanticipated outcomes of that work was the best boards of education, the best models of board governance, urban, rural, suburban, or third ring suburban, which is fast developing. I mean, those four types of communities have very different needs and different levels of resources. But all of them shared highly successful board superintendent governance models and results in their communities if their constituencies were seen as the students and in some cases the parents. And it's when the external adult constituencies or interest groups get involved that it starts to spin out. And I'm going to say something where I'm not speaking on behalf of any group. Those groups can range from the teachers union to Moms for Liberty. And that they have external interests that they're driving doesn't mean they shouldn't be in the process, doesn't mean that they're not a fact of life, but their interests may not be aligned with what the needs of the students are, even though they may both be very well intentioned around what their interests are. And so both both institutions or think tanks found that if board members saw that their primary constituency was students, they tended to have the strongest level of governance. And eventually what's happened is, as we've talked about in other settings, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with school board governance. No one can seem to find a better model that works. So it might be like Winston Churchill says, that democracy is the best of all the bad options for governing countries. School board governance, school boards may be the best option right now in governing communities and school districts.
Well, I thought that was interesting because that's a very different lens by which most school boards or governing entities look at their service, which may be more in the lens of supporting or representing the voter or the
Yep.
taxpayer.
Yep. And at the end of the day, I think it goes to what I say to board members when I talk about this is, especially one-on-one, is end of the day, the local community wants their school district to be successful. And the external groups usually have an agenda that goes beyond the community. And so if you think hyper locally, board members tend to be more successful than driving an agenda for a interest group that they'll find somebody else to replace you if they're not happy with you, if you're dependent on them. And so I think if you're going to go down fighting, you might as well go down fighting around kids rather than some special interest group.
Thank you. Dr. Amidzek, do you have anything else you'd like to say before we close our webinar today?
I'd only like to say thank you very much for the opportunity to share some insights into how boards and superintendents can work together.
Well, thank you both, Dr. Hughes and Dr. Amidzek, for joining us today and sharing this information to help our school boards and superintendents create trust, transparency, and confidence together to focus on positive leadership and students.